In this video, we're going to learn about debugging. Debugging, or the process of figuring out what's not working when some code isn't doing what we expect it to do, isn't something that can be mastered from one video. It's a process that takes practice, as with everything we're learning in this course. This video will give you some initial strategies for debugging, and you'll continue to build on these strategies throughout the course. We'll start with an example from a previous video in this module. We have designed a function named createSquare that takes a size as input and returns a solid blue square of that size. Currently, the code is working as expected. Both tests pass when I run the code. And when I call the function in another cell, I can see that a blue square is returned. Sometimes when we run code, it does not work as we expect. And sometimes we get a red error message. When that happens, we want to read it carefully. Sometimes the message might be long and look overwhelming, and a first instinct may be to try to make the message go away by clearing the output. But the error messages are giving us hints as to how to fix our code, so we want to read them carefully. It takes time and practice to be able to understand all of the error messages, but reading them carefully is a great first step. In our program, I'll introduce some common errors so that we can see what message we get and how to fix it. One common error is forgetting to include the from CS103 import line. So let me delete that. Now, since we've already run the cell and imported everything from the library, we wouldn't actually get an error message yet. If I restart my kernel, now I'm getting a fresh environment in which to run this code. So if I run this code without the from CS103 import star line, let's see what happens. So we get a name error, and it says type check is not defined. And that's because type check is defined in that CS103 library, which we have not currently imported. Even in this small program, there are other examples of things that are defined in the CS103 library that we're using, such as the type image, the function start testing, the function expect, and the function summary. The first error message is always reported, which is why we see an error message about type check. But we also would have got name errors for all of those other names. So now let's put our import statement back. And rerun to make sure the problem is fixed. Another common way to get a name error is to have a typo. So here's an example of where we've defined a function called createSquare, but we're trying to call createQuare, which does not exist, right? I have a typo, I'm missing the letter S. If I try to run this code, I get a name error. It says name createQuare is not defined. When you get a name error, double check that the name that you're using, in this case the name of a function that we're calling, is defined and that there are no typos. So let's fix that and rerun. Another way you could get a name error is if you were calling a function that was defined in a previous cell, but you had not yet run that cell. Let's see what happens if we move this parenthesis. Here I see I get a syntax error, which tells us that the code as written is in some way inconsistent with Python's syntactical rules. You can think of these syntactical rules as the grammar of the programming language. Note that the message includes an indicator of where the error may occur. That gives us a location in the program to start looking for a syntax error, but the error may not be exactly there. In fact, the error is often on the line above the one that's indicated in the error message. This is the case here. The error message shows us line 11, but the missing parenthesis is on line 9. It's often a good strategy to start looking at the line where the syntax error indicates, and move your eyes up and back through the code looking for things like missing parentheses, missing commas, etc. So I'll fix this error and we'll rerun. And now our test pass again. Another example of a syntax error would be if I removed this comma between our call to create square and the expected output of the square. There I can see that the syntax error is pointing almost directly to where my comma is missing. Unfortunately, our syntax errors don't make suggestions as to how to fix the error, but they do hint to where the error may be, which at least helps us narrow down a location of the error. Let's rerun now that we've fixed this. Now our create square function takes one input. Let's see what happens if I try to call it with two inputs. Instead of just giving it one argument for the size, here I'm passing 1 and 0. And the error message that we get is a type error. It says the function create square expects one parameter, but was called with two arguments. Be sure to supply one argument for each parameter. So we can only give exactly one argument for each parameter. And this message is telling us that we've supplied two. So the text that I read there was at the very bottom, but the location is at the very top. So sometimes these messages will be quite long, and you can often find the most relevant information at the top and at the bottom of the error messages. Here I can see from the top it's pointing at line 14. So it's telling me that my problem is there. Let's fix it and run again. Another error that you may see is a type check error. Our type check annotation is intended to help us to check that the input we're giving to a function and the output that we expect are of the right types, or that they match the types in the signature. So let's see what happens if we try to pass a string instead of the number 10. There we get a type check error. It says, while checking parameter s, which is our parameter name, we can see that in the def line on line 4, 10 is a string, not an int. And then it says as expected in, and it shows us our function definition, and then it shows us which line this occurred on, which is line 14. So now I can go to line 14 and I see where I've called it with a square instead of an int, and I can fix that. We would get a similar error if we tried to return something of the wrong type. Here we know from our signature that this function should return an image, but if I comment that out and return a number instead, let's see what our type check shows us. So again, it says type check error. While checking the returned value, 15 is an int, not an image, as expected in, and then it shows us our function definition, and it shows us the line that caused the error. Now note that because this is an error in the return value, although it's pointing at line 14, it's not actually line 14 that I need to fix. The error occurred when that line was executed, but the error is actually in the function's body. So let's change it back to be returning our square and run again. Another common kind of error is related to indentation. As you know, indentation is meaningful in Python. My return statement on line 10 is part of the create square function body because of its indentation. It is indented exactly one tab in from the def line. If I were to change the indentation and run my code, now I get an error that says return outside function. So a return statement must occur in the body of a function, and when its indentation isn't correct, it's not actually part of the function body. If I tab this back in and rerun, we can see that that error now disappears. Similarly, if I had indented too far, it will also generate an error. And in that case, it generates an indentation error because this is an unexpected indent. This is indented further than Python expects it to be. Let's run again to see that our problem was fixed. So that is not an exhaustive list of error messages and debugging strategies or things to check, but it will hopefully help you get started in being able to understand the error message that you receive and be able to fix the code.